yeah, indeed, self-censorship has been sadly a really major feature of life in Hong Kong. And I guess there's a saying, I'm not sure who to attribute it to, but that saying that, that censorship is really just failed self-censorship. So, but if you can get people to censor themselves up front, you don't even need formal censorship because they've already done the job for you. So, yeah.
Hello, I am Cody Ellingham, and this is the Transformation of Value podcast. In this episode, I speak with Antony Dapiran, a prominent Australian lawyer and award-winning author who has become widely known for his writing and commentary on the protest movement in Hong Kong and the reaction from the state. We talk about his book, City on Fire, The Fight for Hong Kong, and we explore the history of the city and its unique monetary and political situation, as well as the role of censorship, Bitcoin, freedom technology, and more. If you would like to support the show and my work, please consider tipping some sats to the show's wallet. Otherwise, pass this episode on to a friend who you think may enjoy it. Every bit of support helps, and I do appreciate it. If you have any questions or feedback, please reach out. My emails are always open, hello@thetransformationofvalue.com. Otherwise, on to the show. So I've been in Hong Kong less than 24 hours, and I must say it's been a trip. It's been a experience, trying to make my way to my apartment and navigating the MRT system and the trains, and trying to get to where I needed to go without a SIM card in my phone. But it's been incredible, and it's really great to connect with you. I don't actually believe we've ever met in person before, and
not in person, no. I mean, over video call and so on.
We've had an extended correspondence.
Yeah, exactly. And I've been following and admiring your work and your photography for many years. So.
Oh no, thank you, and thank you very much for the copy of your book, City on Fire: The Fight for Hong Kong. Yeah. It's been a topic that I've been very interested in for a long time, looking at Hong Kong and kind of what it means. Last time I was here, 2018, it felt like a very different city. How do you feel the city's changed since then?
There's a couple of ways to, I think about it. I mean, on the surface, and you were talking about your arrival here last night, that dynamism, that energy that you feel landing in this city and going into the streets and into the depths of Kowloon or wherever, that's still here. I think that's largely still here, and that hasn't changed. And I mean, of course, some things on the streetscape have changed. There's been an unfortunate crackdown on the beautiful neon signs that used to sort of really illuminate the landscape here, and for sort of various silly regulatory reasons, the government sort of cracked down on them, and most of them have been removed now, which is really sad because that was a great feature of Hong Kong. But still there, that sort of energy and that dynamism that this city's always had is still there. But but underneath the surface, so much has changed in the last 5 years since the 2019 protests ended, and then from 2020 the national security law came in, and of course we had many years of isolation under COVID, and sort of emerging from all of that now. But I think a lot of things have fundamentally changed about the city in terms of its civil society. A lot of obviously the whole idea of there being political opposition or sort of political plurality has been extinguished. Most of the leading opposition politician figures are now in jail. Many of the others have left and gone overseas. So that sort of plurality of political voices is gone. With that, many NGOs have ceased operations and shut down. Much of the independent media has shut down, and all of civil society that's left, arts organizations, whether that's sort of visual arts or performing arts, other media, bookstores, all those sorts of things, all the different aspects of culture really, are questioning how they should operate in this new environment, and therefore sort of questioning what they can and can't say, what they can and can't exhibit, where the lines are around what, as the government sort of seeks to redefine what is and isn't acceptable public discourse. All of civil society has had to sort of reshape and sort of figure out where it stands on that. And so that makes for, under the surface, to the extent that you engage in those aspects of society and culture, it makes it a very different place to what it was. So, yeah.
Oh, thank you. And it seems like for me, my my lived experience of visiting in 2018, which was the first time, and watching Hong Kong from a distance, and I guess in the diaspora of New Zealand, where I grew up, there were a lot of Hong Kong people, and it was part of our, I think, being part of the Asia Pacific community. Hong Kong played a role, and certainly Australia as well. And you're from Melbourne originally, so I guess going back a little bit further, I mean, what is your background, Antony, and how did you find yourself in Hong Kong originally?
I first came to Hong Kong on a family holiday when I was a kid, and sort of was excited by the place and sort of loved the place and thought it was really exciting. And I came back for the second time on a school trip because I was studying Chinese at high school, and our high school had a school trip to China when we were all in sort of 16 years old, and Hong Kong was the first stop on sort of the way into China, and experiencing it again sort of as a teenager and being given the run of the city, which was a pretty brave thing, I think, at the time for our teachers to do, but basically gave us the run of the city and sort of, said, be back by midnight kind of thing. It was an exciting and dynamic place to be. And this was sort of back in the early 90s when Hong Kong was really, I think, at its, that a kind of real peak of Hong Kong culture. And that just made it seem a really exciting place, and a place that I thought I'd always like to come back and live and work. And so after finishing university, and I studied in China as well for a couple of years, I studied in Beijing for a couple of years, I thought, well, if there's a place that I can go that can make use of both my Chinese language skills and I'd been studying law, so my law degree, that Hong Kong was kind of it. So I after I finished university, I came here and started a career as a lawyer, traveling back and forth between here and the mainland, and spent many years working in Beijing as well. As sort of a place where, China and the rest of the world sort of met. And so people like me who were, helping to build those bridges or sort of, cross those bridges could be based and could make a contribution, I guess. So,
yeah. That's interesting. You talk about building bridges and that kind of confluence, that meeting place that Hong Kong represented historically, and I think that's certainly had an appeal to me as well. There's sort of the idea of the city on the harbour and just the airports, and some of the visuals of it certainly appealed to me. But as we talked about, that has changed quite drastically, and since I was last here, it really seems like there's been this chilling effect on what people can say, what people can do, and maybe most pronounced perhaps in the self-censoring that takes place, because as a lawyer, I mean, you understand the importance of words and the precision of language and the precision of law, and yet when you have something like the national security law or some of the other more recent things that have come through around not being able to say things, but you don't necessarily know what you can and cannot say. Would you say that's a fair take on it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is, partly by design, right? And this is something that we've seen in the mainland as well, that if you leave a certain amount of ambiguity around what is and isn't acceptable, everyone will consciously take several steps back just to make sure that they're safe. And so that sort of then acts as a constraint. And yeah, indeed, self-censorship has been sadly a really major feature of life in Hong Kong. And I guess there's a saying, I'm not sure who to attribute it to, but that saying that, that censorship is really just failed self-censorship. But if you can get people to censor themselves up front, that you don't even need formal censorship because they've already done the job for you.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
What stands out to me is there's a couple of contrasts here. So, I flew in last night coming from Japan and now set up in Japan and having left New Zealand 6 months ago. What strikes me is, just the level of the infrastructure, the building, the chaos of construction that is Hong Kong, which is, I guess, is somewhat eternal. It's always been under construction. But, the city, it's a city that has manifested itself not only at the confluence of ideas, but really the confluence of capital, the confluence of investment. It was the head of China, in the sense that that's who you would talk to, and historically that was your entranceway, that was your window to the mainland, and that role of capital, of the flows of goods and services, kind of businesses, banking, all of that. I mean, how would you characterize that compared to perhaps maybe your upbringing, the edges of the world, Melbourne, Australia, these sorts of places? I mean, just broadly, how would you characterize that?
Yeah, I mean, that traditionally has been what gave Hong Kong its energy, that it was where everyone came from around the world as the sort of the window into China, and then likewise from China to step out into the wider world. They'd do so through Hong Kong. And that was what gave Hong Kong its energy and its dynamism, and as you mentioned, also its money. I mean, that's where the money came, and the people followed the money, as it were. And so that's what made it a global city, the so-called international financial centre. And that's, I think, one of the challenges that Hong Kong sort of is facing now, in that it used to be a regional hub, not just the window into and out of China, but also had a broader regional role, connecting the wider region and East Asia and Southeast Asia and the rest of the world. But the developments of the last few years have led to it being very much focused on China and positioning itself as the super connector with China, which is all well and good, except that that's happening now in an environment where China's not that much interested in connecting with the rest of the world, and the rest of the world is not that much interested in connecting with China. In fact, the opposite. Everyone's talking about sort of decoupling and de-risking and sort of moving away. And to the extent that people do want to connect with China, there's not much really stopping them just going there directly. I mean, why go through Hong Kong when you can go straight to Shanghai? And so that sort of leaves Hong Kong in kind of a funny place, that it's lost its sort of regional roles, and a lot of that's been given up to Singapore. At the same time as its role as a sort of a China connector is becoming, I wouldn't go as far as saying irrelevant, but certainly is less interesting to people, and therefore it sort of a little bit, I think, is struggling with what its identity is going to be.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's a cultural take on it. I mean, for me, again, just the zeitgeist, I felt the vibe, I guess you could say, late last night walking around. This is a money city, and the same cannot be said about many of the places I've spent time. Again, I think there's this kind of continental versus island mentality, which we talked about over lunch, but in many parts of New Zealand and arguably Japan as well, there's a sort of sense of tradition or a culture that is maybe separate to pure unbridled capitalism. Whereas Hong Kong, its tradition is that exactly. And so there's a sort of money plays a cultural role as much as just being a functional tool. It really is part of the culture, and it's sort of the part of the hustle and the attitude of everyone, from the grandpa on the street to the young upstart who's come from the mainland. Everyone's here, and it's all about money. And I mean, there's something quite interesting about that. And even in the old days, I imagine that would have been the case as well. You came here, you were working with the banks or whatnot. For me, I guess that stands out as a very interesting kind of model. And it's sort of pointed to quite a lot in certain libertarian circles. Different free market thinkers have looked at Hong Kong as an example of success, whereas you had quite regular central planning and a lot of things in China in the same period. Why Hong Kong was so much more successful. So yeah, I mean those two things are interesting. But as you say, we've entered this new world. You can just deal directly with China, but can you? It's increasingly difficult, and who wants to do that?
Yeah. No, but no, you're quite right. That this is certainly a money town, and it's an incredibly materialistic kind of place, and money does make the world go round here, certainly.
It is a money town, and something that we discussed over lunch that I found very interesting. If we look at the money, so I have a 100 Hong Kong dollar bill here in front of me, and it's actually obviously a promissory note, but it's from the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, also known as HSBC, a private company issuing currency, which is quite a unique thing in the world. We haven't really seen that. Most places it's generally central bank money. And at the same time, I have here another note that's issued by the Bank of China, and there's several others.
One other, Standard Chartered Bank, is the third note issuing bank. So
and I thought that was very interesting to me, because that echoes this kind of free banking idea. There's perhaps a myth potentially of the American Gilded Era or Scottish free banking has been talked about as well. But I mean, in a money city like Hong Kong, what is the role of big banking?
Yeah, I guess there's a couple of different roles. There's, of course, there's the note issuing role that the banks play, which it's funny because it's one of those aspects of living in Hong Kong that you don't really stop to think about necessarily. Living here, you just get the money out of the ATM machine and spend it to the extent that you're using cash, which is less and less these days. And you don't give much thought to it, but you're right, it is unusual compared to most other places in the world to have the privately owned banks being the ones that issue the notes. But it's just sort of the system that we sort of take for granted here. And I've got to say, I'm not entirely on top of the historical background to why that is. But that's sort of one aspect. And I think also, just interestingly, HSBC is such a huge institution here that it does sort of play a cultural role in the city as being one of the, perhaps alongside, Cathay Pacific and one or two others, sort of the companies that represent Hong Kong and globally and sort of is seen as sort of part of the cultural identity of the city. But yeah, I think a lot of, people do just sort of take the banks for granted, and they're doing what they do in sort of other cities around the world. I mean, the other interesting sort of parallel to the banking system that happens here is the Octopus contactless payment system, which is interesting because Hong Kong was really a pioneer when this was first introduced back in the 90s. That there was this contactless payment system that was used for all the public transport and then was rolled out to stores and retail outlets as well. And you could, use your Octopus card to pay for stuff in the 7-Eleven and your coffees at Starbucks and all those kind of things. But now, of course, that system hasn't changed. And meanwhile, sort of the rest of the world has caught up and gone, beyond that with contactless payments in terms of, we have that with the credit cards these days, of course, but also on mobile phones, things like, Alipay and WeChat Pay and these sorts of things, which are ubiquitous in the mainland and sort of increasingly used here as well. So, yeah, the rest of the world has sort of caught up and surpassed Hong Kong on contactless payments, but Octopus sort of still endures here as sort of a system that people still use and sort of live with their day to day. And yeah, I think a lot of people you can get by with nothing but an Octopus card for, the only thing you really need cash for are taxis, which stubbornly still refuse to accept, credit cards, let alone contactless payments mostly. And so, yeah, that's sort of another sort of interesting part of I guess, monetary culture in Hong Kong.
Yeah, well, I mean, speaking just briefly on culture as well, you notice every now and then you come across these sort of furnaces out on the street, which I believe are used for burning money. Hell money, they
spirit
call it.
Money, yeah,
Spirit money,
yeah, that's right.
Which is an interesting cultural tradition. Money for the afterlife.
Yes.
But on that note, just talking about the monetary side and currency, you've got these different formats that currency comes in, and so we're talking about Octopus card, we're talking about the paper notes. Digital, actually, perhaps plastic notes.
One of them is plastic.
One of them's plastic. One of the many makers here, we've got plastic and paper. And then we've also got, obviously, digital money like your Alipays and your WeChats and these things. So you've got these different media for money. However, going a bit deeper, that relationship to what actually gives that value. So Hong Kong being a special administrative region of the People's Republic of China, what is the relationship between the Hong Kong dollar and the RMB coming out of China?
So they are two entirely separate currencies. The RMB is the currency in the mainland. It's regulated and controlled by the People's Bank of China, and it's a non-free-floating currency, a non-freely convertible currency. It's subject to capital controls. Its exchange rate is effectively controlled by the government, and you need government approvals to convert money on the capital account out of RMB into foreign currencies. And so it's a sort of controlled currency. The Hong Kong dollar here in Hong Kong is a totally different currency. It's managed by the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. It is a freely convertible currency, and there are no capital controls. You can convert into and out of Hong Kong dollars freely as you wish from foreign exchange. But the interesting thing about the Hong Kong dollar is it's subject to a what they call a peg, currency peg. So it is pegged to a narrow band of centered around 7.75 Hong Kong dollars to $1. So it's pegged to the US dollar, and it's allowed to float just by a tiny amount up and down around that band. And yeah, that is sort of the system of the Hong Kong dollar. So it's freely convertible, but the value is pegged to the US dollar.
Interesting. I'm not sure if you know the answer to this, but that peg, do you know how that is managed?
It's managed by the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, and they buy and sell Hong Kong dollars on the market to ensure that I think it stays at that peg.
Yeah, it's interesting. We're talking about the US dollar here because right now in Japan, the yen is at an incredibly weak point compared to the US dollar. And I wonder within Asia what the connection is here when you've got a currency pegged to USD. That also by virtue would be pegged to the dominance of the USD. And do you think that's had any role in terms of cost of living, the relation with neighbouring countries, etc.?
Certainly, and I should preface all this by saying I'm by no means a currency expert or an economist or any of those things, but just from a very rudimentary understanding, it has two impacts. It means that Hong Kong can't devalue its currency to become more competitive, and so if it's looking to become more competitive compared to other economies around the region, it has to do it in other ways. It can't use its currency in the way that other places do. And it also means that because its currency is pegged to the US dollar, it also is forced by default to import wholesale US monetary policy. It can't have its own independent monetary policy. So interest rates in Hong Kong are basically determined by whatever the interest rate is for the US dollar set by the Fed in the US. And so that has all those things have an impact in terms of interest rates on what people are paying for their borrowings in Hong Kong dollars, and in terms of inflation here as well. It means that Hong Kong's monetary policies and the things the government can do to address issues like inflation and cost of living and issues in the economy are constrained by the peg, as it were.
That's interesting. I'm wondering the relationship here. I mean, US dollars globally are a reserve currency. They're a medium of exchange that a lot of people, they want US dollars. If you are going through Hong Kong for Chinese manufactured goods, I mean, is there I guess effectively you're going through the US dollar to get to that in a roundabout way.
Yeah, you're exposed to the fluctuations of the US dollar, as it were. Yeah.
And that perhaps is part of historically the strategy, as far as I'm aware, of Chinese manufacturers is to basically be at a certain rate relative to the US dollar so that they are cheap and easily exportable and leads to market dominance and manufacturing dominance for China, right?
Yeah. And that's been one of the over the years, one of the bugbears in sort of the US-China relationship, that the US used to complain that China was keeping its currency artificially low to make its exports more competitive, and there's sort of been pressure on that going back over the years. So yeah.
Are you familiar with the Triffin dilemma?
I'm not, no.
So there's this idea that when you have the reserve currency of the world, the exports of that country become very or highly uncompetitive because you're not able to compete with wages locally. You're going to have to pay your workers so much more if you are the reserve currency country. So, for example, the United States, I mean, they've hollowed out their manufacturing class and their middle class ever since the Second World War, in part, arguably, to support this US dollar global dominance. And perhaps there's a sort of symbiotic relationship here where you've got manufacturing coming out of China, extremely cheap for the US, and the Chinese just work hard and they get the things made. But what are the long-term impacts for China, do you think, on that side of the coin?
Yeah, and I think good question. I think China's facing that now, in the sense that they've got all this, they've built their economy through an investment-led economy. They've now got all this sort of industrial overcapacity that the rest of the world is complaining about, is leading to them dumping underpriced goods on foreign markets and may lead to tariffs and various sort of trade repercussions. They have the hangover of a real estate bubble that they're trying to figure out how to clean up. And so, I think there's been a lot of, perhaps the repercussions for the Chinese economy are sort of just starting to unfold now. I mean, they've been able to grow incredibly quickly. I guess they've been off a low base, but have grown their economy incredibly quickly and become much wealthier than what they were before this process. But how sustainable that's going to be and what happens in the future, I think, is very much an open question.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. We're talking about money. We're talking about a very dynamic region of the world. For me, obviously, I'm very interested in looking at Bitcoin and sort of alternative ways of approaching these challenges, which it really does feel like a number of factors have come together, particularly around the period of COVID. You've got massive US money printing, and as you said before, Hong Kong and China, they sort of are, or globally, every country is plugged into that Fed policy, the interest rates and the money printing that goes on in the United States. And then, seeing that today, I mean, how would you characterize, I guess, the lived experience of Hong Kong everyday people? I mean, how do you think they're aware of what's going on? Do you think that it's materially impacting them?
Certainly it's materially impacting them. And I think certainly, for the average Hong Konger, life has been difficult. There's been inflation, prices have gone up, wages have not gone up. Wages have been incredibly stagnant here over, the last decade or two. Property prices, on the one hand, are incredibly unaffordable, but also sort of collapsing. So there are both, on the one hand, people who can't afford to live in a decent sized place, and other people who've bet on the property prices sort of never-ending ascension, which has sort of stopped and reversed. And so I think certainly the experience is that it's a difficult time and people are doing it tough. But I don't think necessarily that people connect all of that to the bigger picture questions of monetary policy and sort of fiscal policy and things like that.
So pulling on that thread of housing, so this is a major issue in New Zealand and Australia. As you know, young people basically aren't able to afford houses. And we've just seen, and you're probably more plugged into this than me, but the issues with Evergrande in China and just the real estate ghost towns and all of that. But for Hong Kong, so you're saying that bubble has, I wouldn't say burst, but what's happened there?
It has. So property prices have dropped back, I think, about 20% from their peak. But the dilemma is that in absolute terms, property prices are still way too high. And so for the average young person, university graduate ever starting a career with the salary that they're making, it's going to be almost impossible for them to buy a decent family-sized apartment or home. So in absolute terms, the property is sort of unaffordable for ordinary people. But at the same time, there is a very significant portion of the middle class and the upper class who have bought property in the past, and the value has gone up. And anything that the government knows, anything that they do to try to make housing more affordable for sort of new entrants to the market has the risk of sort of at the same time crashing the values of everyone who already holds property. So they've kind of got this, in a way, a rock and a hard place. They can't make property more affordable for one group of the community without sort of, collapsing the property market for the other half of the community. And of course, many of the politicians making these decisions themselves have an interest in property values because they all own real estate. So it's sort of this funny tightrope they're trying to walk. I'm sort of not sure how you sort of square that circle.
Do you think, though, the historical myth of Hong Kong as a free market, as unbridled capitalism, are you saying that has changed perhaps, and now we've got more protectionist policies, or we've got more interventionism with things like the housing market? What was it like in the old days?
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess two things to say about that. Firstly, I mean, certainly I think it seems that the government is more willing to be more interventionist than it was. And I think there's certainly also pressure from Beijing coming on the Hong Kong government to think more creatively, to take more action, to do things that they wouldn't have done in the past, so to be less laissez-faire than what they had been. And so I think that certainly is a development that they are moving towards. At the same time, I always sort of would urge a bit of caution around this idea that Hong Kong has always been this sort of this myth. It's a laissez-faire, kind of free sort of openly capitalist society, because it's essentially it's an oligopoly. There is a couple of large, powerful tycoon groups that that dominate every aspect of the economy here, from the property to the utilities to the kind of consumer real estate stuff. And there's sort of a saying that you can't live a day in Hong Kong without at least giving $1 to Li Ka-shing, who is the richest man in Hong Kong, who owns Cheung Kong and Hutchison, these big conglomerates that are own everything from sort of property to utilities to supermarkets to sort of many other things. So yeah, it's a place that was run sort of, I guess, with the government selling land to the big tycoon real estate developers, and that money being used to sort of effectively fund the budget, and then the real estate developers then dominating, monopolizing the real estate market. So that's sort of where Hong Kong's economy is built on. Yeah.
I can see what you mean. The history is there. It didn't come out of nowhere. And I guess, I mean, this is a challenge to some of the thinking around, say, free markets and that, and how they operate, because they're never free, and they're always birthed from some precondition that came in, and I think that's what I'm interested in here with kind of, I guess, geopolitically and globally, say the breakdown of US, China, Russia relations, the increasingly multipolar world that we're entering into, where there's a high likelihood that many of these large countries are not really going to be able to trust each other, yet they still need to do trade in one form or another. So, I mean, moving from a unipolar US-centric superpower to a multipolar world, right. What are your thoughts on that?
Certainly I think Hong Kong feels that it's been in a way been a victim of that, in the sense that it feels that it's been used as a I guess a pawn by the US to attack China, or as being collateral damage in sort of the ongoing competition between the US and China. And I guess traditionally Hong Kong was kind of in a way a place where the US and China interfaced. I mean, it certainly was where the rest of the world and China interfaced, but the US was a very big part of that. And it seems like that has broken down a little bit. And I think there's a lot of people in Hong Kong who feel, people, not ordinary people in Hong Kong, but people in sort of Hong Kong policy government circles who feel that that's been a sort of, Hong Kong has been unfair collateral damage in sort of that trade war, if you want to put it that way. But at the same time, it seems that also is potentially an opportunity for Hong Kong, and this is not necessarily in a good way or a bad way, but the fact that it is a place where China and companies from businesses from other governments from other poles, such as Russia, for example, can meet and do business, and the Middle East, and so on. So there's a lot of, I think, Middle East interest in Hong Kong, and sort of investment and capital flows through Hong Kong. There is a lot of Russian activity in Hong Kong as well. And so this idea that perhaps in a multipolar world, Hong Kong can continue to have that sort of role is potentially an interesting future path for Hong Kong.
Would you, though, to clarify, would you identify that this trend towards a multipolar world, is that something that you've seen happen, and do you think will continue to happen? Or
I think so. I mean, I think that clearly, China is much stronger and more assertive, and has perhaps emerged as a pole where we wouldn't have thought of it in those terms 10 years ago, say, or 10, 15 years ago, and it is increasingly looking to work with Russia and a few other places to sort of act as a counterbalance to the US. And the EU is sort of trying to maintain an independent sort of policy among all that. And then it does seem a little bit, though, that maybe we're not necessarily heading for multipolarity, but a bipolarity, sort of US versus China, where everyone's going to be forced to pick a side. And that's sort of, it's obviously some countries have already picked sides, and places like Australia and the UK and Canada sort of seem to have thrown their lots in with the US, and sort of query where New Zealand sits in that. It's a bit ambiguous sometimes. It seems like Japan has sort of thrown its lot in there too. Russia and China are clearly got a very strong relationship. India is really interesting because it's sort of the other really big country that sits in the middle and doesn't really fit neatly with any of those. I mean, it's no friend of China. I mean, China's much closer to its arch rival Pakistan, and there's still active border disputes going on between India and China, and their soldiers are beating each other with clubs on the border in the Himalayas. Yet at the same time, India is quite happy to trade with Russia and doesn't go along with everything that the US asks for. So that's a really interesting. And the role of and other countries like that. I think Brazil and others is sort of interesting that they don't necessarily automatically follow any of those camps. And so, I guess to the extent maybe that it is multipolar, but the strength of the different poles will be different.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, focusing on the bipolar, the duality of it is interesting, and certainly that feels like that's maybe what the big moves are. Though, I mean, historically, Russia and China, there's been a strained relationship there, and I'm no geopolitical expert, but the Sino-Soviet split historically, maybe there's some fundamental issues there that mean that it may not work out longer term. However, I guess what I'm interested in is we're talking here about the money. We're talking about sort of the role of money and how it is almost a manifestation of these political forces, these strategies. The pegging of the dollar the pegging of the Hong Kong dollar to the US dollar, for example. I mean, it's a strategy. It's a technique to achieve some ends. And looking at the emergence of things like Bitcoin, which we were talking about earlier at lunch, and I appreciate this isn't an area that you're super versed in, but I mean, a global neutral third-party currency, I mean, what do you see that doing to this multipolar, bipolar world, perhaps?
I certainly see the utility, right, and the attractiveness of having a means of transferring value, transferring money anywhere in the world, pretty much instantaneously and frictionlessly. And that's something that just, generally is a convenience, but in an environment where there might be potentially, governments wanting to sort of restrict that in various ways. Obviously it has clear utility and it's clearly attractive. I think the trick comes in when governments do want to restrict that in various ways. So, you have sort of, you can, transfer your Bitcoin around, but if you ever want to access, the sort of various on-ramps and off-ramps to get it back into the real world economy, governments can restrict that, through your ability to transfer that into real cash, and sort of, if that's happening through institutions, through sort of KYC checks and all those kind of things. So I think, and obviously, the mainland already sort of regulates cryptocurrency and Bitcoin pretty tightly. So, to the extent that it's its own ecosystem and can exist without having to sort of have touch points into the real world where governments and regulators have an opportunity to sort of regulate that and put up barriers or checkpoints, I think there's clearly a role for it.
Well, I mean, just as an anecdote, I mentioned earlier, I brought a mining machine from a vendor in Hong Kong. It was a Chinese-made piece of hardware, and I actually paid that vendor with Bitcoin, and there was no KYC, there was no details. It just happened, and the thing arrived in New Zealand. And for me, that maybe the analogy here is something like a Shenzhen and the Miracle on the Pearl Delta. And that, in just a few decades, this, apocryphal, fishing village turned into the world's manufacturing hub. Is there something similar perhaps with Bitcoin where at the fringes there's transactions and things taking place, that desire to just make money however you need to, despite capital controls and government intervention, is going to override, and manufacturers just start accepting Bitcoin for payments, even if they cannot freely transfer it into cash, but no one uses cash in the mainland anyway. So I don't know, do you think maybe there's sort of some thread there that can be pulled on?
Yeah, no, I see that. Yeah, certainly to the extent that people are willing to transact in it directly and that becomes its own sort of self-contained economy. That entirely makes sense.
Yeah, because I mean, one theory. I mean, we've talked about the different formats that currency takes, and one theory that I've talked with other guests on this show about is, maybe it's that the manufacturers, the large companies, are the only ones who really get to use it at scale like that, and normal workers are still just using scrip and taking RMB down to the shop, or they're using some sort of mobile app for payments in the mainland. But for those international flows, a United States manufacturer or a US company wanting to import goods or whatever, those international flows being settled in Bitcoin. I mean, I think that for me seems a little bit more realistic than consumer payments, which don't.
No, you're right. Yeah, and to a certain extent, you're relying on the network effect, right? That you'd sort of say, well, why should I accept Bitcoin? What am I going to do with it? Except when you get to the point where you accept it because everyone else is accepting it too. So what you do with it is you spend it on something else. So that sort of once there are enough people using it and are willing to transact in it directly, then that sort of that network effect sort of takes over.
And I mean I guess the visual example for me, we were just talking about the HSBC notes here, which most people probably have never even looked at that in any great detail, that this is actually a private bank issued money, and there's some historical reason for that and some a priori genesis there, but it doesn't really matter. And if at the end of the day, in a number of years, if it's just simply too difficult to transact using RMB or US dollars or whatever, especially, I mean, you can get into some scenarios there around things like Bitcoin hardware or high-tech goods. I mean, we've got Huawei as one example where maybe there's some tariffs, there's controls on what can be exported and imported, and you decide, well, look, we're just going to go around that. by using another currency to buy it. And maybe that's the sort of thing that just kickstarts this.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I can see a logical argument that can be built there. Yeah.
So sorry, I'm sort of, I am pulling on that thread because I'm here. Well, actually, there's a Bitcoin event taking place, which is one of the reasons. Obviously, I wanted to catch up with you and a few others. But Hong Kong has played a role historically in this kind of Bitcoin scene. We've just had a Bitcoin ETF approved for Hong Kong. You may have seen the news.
Yeah, and absolutely. That was interesting, right? Because it's the first Bitcoin spot ETF in Asia, I think, and one of the few in the world. I mean, the US were agonizing over this for years before they finally approved it. Just quite recently,
and then boom, we got the Hong Kong one come out.
Hong Kong done that now. So it is interesting, and I think there is a certain degree to which Hong Kong, perhaps is willing to be a bit. Previously, it was sort of a really at the forefront of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency back in the days when a group of young folks opened up a little-known company called FTX here, and but I think Hong Kong is sort of looking at sort of building on Bitcoin and all the things that around that kind of cryptocurrency, Web3, blockchain, whatever. It's sort of an area that they want to encourage and develop here. So
I think there are some challenges with the kind of the get rich quick, and FTX is a perfect example of that. This approach to what Bitcoin really means, and I, as I said, I appreciate it's maybe a new territory for you, but for me, I think we're talking about housing, we're talking about long-term investments, and Bitcoin for me really sits in that space as a new store of value, a new paradigm shift. It's not just a surface level. It's not another octopus card. It's not just another way of moving fiat money around. It's actually a whole new thing, and those can be confused in the market, and cities like New York and Hong Kong, they sort of tend to conflate the two, because it's kind of hard when you're so close to money as it currently stands to zoom out and be like, well, actually, are we looking at a revolution in what money is and our relationship to how we move money around? Sort of like, moving from the gold standard to fiat money in the 20th century. So I guess my paradigm is I'm looking at Bitcoin as a very disruptive technology, similar to something like the internet. Newspapers have died and we now have the internet. There's no internet 2, there's just the internet. I don't know, maybe based on what we've talked about, how do you see that paradigm shifting of money with regards to Bitcoin, perhaps? Sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. I think there are a few challenges. The first challenge, I think, is just that network effect of you needing there be enough people using it that there is a use case for it. So it sort of has to sort of self-justify, and I think that I fear that might not come until large institutions are willing to deal in it and transact in it. And I'm not sure. I guess I don't know enough to know what the barriers to that might be. Certainly, I think the volatility is a concern. You can't sort of. It's difficult to imagine sort of, agreeing a Bitcoin price to sell your house and you're going to sort of, agree it now and sort of settle the transaction in 3 months' time, with the risk that the value, in Bitcoin might go up and down by, 30% in that time. So I think the volatility is something that people are nervous about. And I think with any new technology, just sort of getting people comfortable and familiar with it and getting it in a way that's user-friendly is sort of a challenge. I know it's certainly much easier than it was with Bitcoin, but even still, sort of thinking about, even for a relatively tech-savvy person, you do have to sort of, it takes some figuring to get a Bitcoin wallet and sort of buy Bitcoin and those kind of things. And you think of sort of your average, old age pensioner or whatever, and sort of them getting comfortable with it, or there being a consumer-facing technology that means it's easier for people like that to use it readily, I think is, I guess, the other piece of the puzzle. So I feel like there's just a lot of different things that all sort of need to fall into place for it to really be widely adopted.
Yeah, no, I see that, and I guess I'm not here to espouse any particular vision for the future. I certainly think there's a couple of paths that this could take, and one of them, coming back to your writing and your work exploring kind of how Hong Kong has changed, the Hong Kong protests, the challenges there. I mean, one use case is that for a very long time, maybe it continues to really just be a alternative and a way for the dissidents, the unbanked, people like this to access some kind of money, and it sort of stays there. One other possibility, as we discussed with the HSB example, there's not necessarily a logic to it. It just, people start using it and the incentives align, and that's where I think maybe some of these capital controls and these sort of issues we're seeing come out of not only China but the US and many places, as maybe inflation starts to ramp up, as they try and corral people into a CBDC, for example. People start saying, hey, hold on a minute, and more people start jumping ship, and we enter not only into a unipolar dominance of fiat money, but into a multipolar world where there is fiat currencies and Bitcoin sort of moving and waxing and waning in between each other, which they already are. And in the last 14, 15 years, Bitcoin's gone from nothing to being listed on the Hong Kong stock exchange as an ETF, right? So
yeah, no, it's a good point. I think that idea of the sort of the dissidents and the unbankable and so on is interesting, and that's certainly been a focus of the regulators here on how to
stop it,
how to stop people they don't like, and dissidents, crowdfunding, for example, and how to stop them when they leave Hong Kong, being able to access their funds here or their pensions and so on. And been cases where opposition politicians have sort of gone into exile overseas and have found their HSBC accounts blocked or so on. And it's kind of interesting that someone could memorize their wallet seed and get on a plane and fly somewhere with nothing physical and yet take their whole life savings with them, which is really interesting. And you can see why governments obviously makes them nervous for all the sort of concerns around money laundering and so on. But there is certainly you see a use case around that, obviously.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you mentioned money laundering, because I'm sure HSBC has got to be one of the top dogs for money laundering, isn't it?
That's right.
They take the cake.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't name any particular companies, but Hong Kong generally has been seen plenty of its fair share of money laundering in the past. Yeah.
Yes. No, I appreciate that. Yeah, man. Well, look, I think we've covered a few different topics. I mean, for me, you're here, you're based here, and you see not only the kind of high-level political machinations, but the cultural impact of and the cultural changes that are taking place. And for me, visiting after 5 years, 1980, more over 5 years, it feels like the city has changed. The city that I romanticized, I must admit, a little bit. It feels like it's changed, and there's just, I don't know, it feels like we're waiting for the next thing to happen. I don't know how else to describe it.
Yeah,
sort of just. Maybe COVID, it was quite tough here as well with the lockdowns.
Yeah, look, I mean, we didn't have strict lockdowns as such. In fact, at no stage did we have an actual lockdown. We had sort of restrictions on restaurants and dining hours and public gatherings and all those kind of things, like many, many, many restrictions, but no actual lockdowns. But what we did have was very strict quarantine procedures. And so for most of the 3 years of COVID, 3 years of COVID, 20, 21, 22, you could not, if you wanted to fly into Hong Kong, you had to do 21 days hotel quarantine, which is pretty brutal, pretty huge disincentive to anyone traveling here. So it just meant that we were all kind of stuck here, and we couldn't readily travel, and no one came here to visit. So the place was just very isolated. And and so all sorts of crazy stuff, like, in the early days, if people who were tested, not even in the early days, all the way through, if you were tested positive for COVID, you were dragged off to an isolation camp, and they were sort of, potentially separating children from families and all these kind of things that just made, a very nervous environment to live in, because you weren't quite sure what was going to happen and what you might be subject to, with sort of building lockdowns and building testing and these kind of things. So it was a traumatic experience, I think, for the city as a whole, and a very isolating experience. And so it's been difficult, I think, for to a sense for the city to kind of plug back into the rest of the world again.
Do you think there's any relationship between the timing of the Hong Kong protests and the issues with COVID and the outbreak and the pandemic?
Well, the COVID outbreak effectively ended the protests. So the protests were in 2019. They kind of peaked November, December 2019 at the same time as sort of COVID was just starting to emerge. the last big protests were around, I think, New Year's Day 2020 and early 2020, and then COVID emerged and the government instituted sort of, public gathering bans. And that basically put an end to the cycle of continuous protests. And then after that, the national security law was brought in pretty quickly thereafter. And I don't know, you could sort of argue that perhaps, the government used the fact that COVID was happening and the rest of the world was distracted to sort of push that through without much, outcry or opposition. I think they would have done it anyway, COVID or not. But yeah, that then really put an end to any kind of public protest whatsoever. So yeah.
Understood. Well, look, Antony, I really appreciate your time. If people want to learn more about you, your writing, your work, where can they go?
I'm on Twitter at AntD, ANTD. I'm not as active there as I used to be, but I'm still sort of lurk and post occasionally. And I guess also you could go to my website, which is antonydapiran.com, ANTONYDAPIRAN.com.
Cool. Thank you very much, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you. Good stuff, man.
Thank you for listening. I do hope you enjoyed the show. I am Cody Ellingham, and that was The Transformation of Value. If you would like to get in touch, please send me an email at hello@thetransformationofvalue.com, and I will get back to you.